Hello, everyone, and welcome to Seattle Rotary, the fourth oldest Rotary Club in the world. I am your president-elect, Cindy Runger. Hey, thank you. So just one quick announcement. You might see that anybody had a fruit plate, the cup is a little bit light. So if you need like an extra one when we sit down, feel free to raise your hand and we'll help you out. So anyway, so let me tell you a little bit about where our current president and King 5 News anchor Mark Wright is, because it's a pretty cool story. So I'll get into that before we start the program. But Mark received a special invitation from Rotary International to go to Sundance. This is the final push for the eradication of polio once and for all, and a small group are gathering. They've committed to raise $5 million. And Mark will discuss the role media is playing to eradicate polio. So go Mark, representing Seattle 4. Yeah. So I'm excited about today's program. So, one of the benefits of being part of one of the largest Rotary clubs in the world is having a deep pool of talented members. So today, we'll have our very own CNN contributor, Jill Doherty, lead a conversation with our guest speaker, General Barry McCaffrey, on an issue that's in the forefront of all of our minds, is national security. So I guarantee you it's going to leave you thinking. But first, let's kick this off with some inspiration and song. First, we'll have past President Todd Sommerfeld inspire us with some spoken word. And then Linda Ruff, who is the owner of Ruff and Associates, will lead us through the national anthem. Todd, come on up.
So with civility in public discourse seemingly possibly in decline, I was pondering another way of engaging Rotary's motto of service above self. So with that in mind, I invite you each in your own way to pray or reflect with me. Great Creator, in a world too often devolved into brash and sometimes belligerent bold speak, guide each of us to speak and behave in patience, kindness, and grace in the Rotary ideal of service above self. And all God's Rotarians said, Amen.
So now to our main event, challenges to U.S. national security. So as I mentioned earlier, Jill Doherty will be introducing and speaking with our guest, General McCaffrey. So we've reserved time at the end for questions, and our mics will be Seattle Goodwill President and CEO, Gerald Campbell, and Lillian Sherman, Executive Director of the Pike Place Market Foundation. So please remember to keep your question succinct, emphases on succinct, and question singular. So, and now a little bit about Jill. So if Jill looks familiar, it's because she served as a CNN correspondent for 3 decades, reporting from more than 50 countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, North Korea, and Russia. Jill is a distinguished visiting practitioner at the UW's Evans School of Public Policy, a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in DC, a CNN contributor, a Vladimir Putin expert, as well as just a fascinating person. So just chatting with her over coffee is like accessing an active Wikipedia on like global affairs. So one minute it's like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then next it's China and Russia and the relationship to North Korea. So you have to strap on your running shoes to keep up. So Jill, take it away.
All right, thank you. Barry, this is great. Cindy, thank you very much. Don't trust Wikipedia. You can write it yourself. Only joking, I use it all the time. But I am really, really glad to be here with Barry McCaffrey, General Barry McCaffrey. I've known...
Or Your Excellency, whichever.
I did bow down when I saw you this morning, so it's already done. But in typical style, Ken has me on a very tight leash. So I'll just tell you the lay of the land, give a brief introduction to a man who needs no introduction, and then we'll get into about 20 minutes of talking, a little chat back and forth, and then we have 13 minutes of questions per Ken. Not 15, not 10, 13 minutes. So we'll keep it nice and tight. But so retired general, 4-star general Barry McCaffrey, West Point grad, which I think says it all, basically. He served in the U.S. Army for 32 years. And at retirement, and I think this is really important when I was reading this and thinking how important this was, most highly decorated serving general with 3 Purple Hearts for being wounded in combat, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 2 Silver Stars for valor. So he is a soldier, but he is also a diplomat. In fact, in 1992, the State Department honored him with the Superior Honor Award for Principal Negotiation Team for START II, Nuclear Arms Control Treaty. So I think why it's so valuable for me, and I think for us, to talk with Barry McCaffrey, is that he knows the military side of it, he knows the diplomatic side of it, and he knows the political side of it. And all of these things come together, I think, in the issues that we're going to discuss. So national security, where do we begin? You know, I always think of that phrase, nothing concentrates your thoughts like the knowledge that you will be shot at dawn. So I think of where's the incoming? You know, where are the missiles? Like, are there missiles? Since we're in Seattle, which would be one of the first targets in a nuclear war. No, you know this. So where are the missiles coming from? And then maybe we get into broader questions. So the missiles could be coming from, let's say, North Korea, Iran maybe. So let's start with both of those. Let's start, I think, Iran, because it is just so dense and complex. But let's start with the Iran nuclear deal. President Trump has said it's an embarrassment. It's a very bad deal. You have Rex Tillerson in Europe basically trying to browbeat the Europeans, our allies, to change it. So is that a good strategy? Do you think that the administration or Rex Tillerson can actually, push the Europeans to reopen this deal, which was years in the making? And would that be, ultimately a good idea to do that?
Well, first of all, Jill, I'm glad to join you again. The two of us are on a panel at University of Washington where Jill teaches. I always like to remind people that I paid tuition to UW for 12 years. And it was the only check I liked writing, I might add. My 3 kids all went through there. And I'm also sorry Mark Wright isn't here today. I work with him on King 5 TV. He's such a terrific leader and person, so engaged. And I love being a Rotary. I'm an honorary member of the Yakima Rotary, the center of the universe. I always love going there when we're over there. Well, look, by the way, one correction on Jill's opening remarks. Last night there was some serious speculation, I think on CNN, that the first North Korean nuclear weapon would be aimed at Mar-a-Lago, not Seattle.
I guess they're relieved.
And I was in Hawaii disgracefully for a month, supposedly working on a book where we had the false missile alert. And it had it, so I was on like 6 or 7 times along with one of my MSNBC colleagues talking about what you do in civil defense if a 250 kiloton weapon goes off right over Honolulu and 1,000 yards up. Talk about the Iranian deal. It's a complex one. Arguably, if you started to look at national security threats that you and I ought to care about, terrorism wouldn't be at the top, not even remotely. Dealing with the Russians is a challenge. Jill knows so much about it. But essentially, they're still a small third world nation with a GNP less than that of Italy and an active duty military force that's barely bigger than the U.S. Marine Corps' total strength. So who are the threats? And what are our national security issues? And do we have a national security strategy? That's the challenge to this administration and every other. It's the most important responsibility. I personally believe, and this is a frequently badly received comment, that the Iranian nuclear accord was a bad deal. We shouldn't have done it. We ended up putting well over $150 billion into their coffers. We got nothing back in return on countering their widespread involvement, the Shiite arc through Lebanon of terrorism. I don't think we really prevented them from becoming a nuclear power. I think they're probably a year breakout away from having operational nukes anyway. So within 15 years, they're going to be a declared nuclear power. It was a bad deal. I think they stretched to get it. John Kerry, a friend and somebody I admire, got the deal that he could get in the time they had remaining. I think it outraged most of our Sunni Muslim allies in the Middle East, the Saudis and others, the Egyptians. It certainly outraged the Israelis. And I think you could argue that it made nuclear conflict more probable rather than less. And I say that because I think if you're the Israeli national security team, and if you end up looking, they now have operational missiles that can range throughout Europe, never mind Israel. If they can fabricate a nuke, which I think they could do in a year, then Israel will spend a ton of money to understand what's their command and control system, where are the missiles, where are the nukes stored, what's the political release authority look like it, and the minute they think they're under impending launch, they will preempt with a nuclear strike of a couple of hundred weapons on Iran. That's not good. So all foreign policy, in my view, ought to be designed as almost our #1 national security goal. How do you prevent nuclear conflict from occurring in the 25 years to come? It's not always obvious. So that's a long answer to an important question.
Well, just a quick follow-up, though. Then do you agree with what President Trump is doing, trying to pull out or threaten to pull out, when the other signatories do not agree with that?
No, I think that's silly. Secretary Jim Mattis, we ought to thank God when we get up in the morning that Mattis is the Secretary of Defense. And I would add to that John Kelly in the White House. Mattis has already said categorically, and I couldn't agree more, it's too late to pull out. The money's already headed in that direction. There's no way we will reinstitute the economic constraints on Iran that we had achieved. So it's just a bad notion to pull out. And my guess is he's going to do it. And we're going to be isolated even more. It's one of a series of increasing senses of U.S. alienation from the global community. So I think that's the wrong path to follow.
And that's exactly what I want you to do as we go along. Give the big picture. Give the, let's say, the signs along the road of the big issues that we should be looking at. But let's take another one, North Korea. Very strange. You know, a few weeks ago, it felt like we were going to have a missile coming here, maybe not to Mar-a-Lago, but to here from the North Koreans. And then all of a sudden, you have a joint team going to the Olympics, North Korea, South Korea. You have a lot of soft power diplomacy being used by the North Koreans. I know they're going to have a military parade right around the time of the Olympics, so we'll get another soft power message. But so let me ask it this way. Is the strategy of insulting Little Rocket Man working?
Well, if it wasn't for Little Rocket Man and President Trump, I wouldn't be on TV, I'll tell you that. I don't know. You know, one of the things that you most prize as a military officer is objectivity, and I struggle to remain objective and not get situational on these issues. First of all, I personally believe that all of what's going on right now is background noise. We're facing a binary decision. That's it. The North Koreans are not going to denuclearize, period. They probably got 60 weapons. They now have an operational capability, the intermediate range ballistic missiles, meaning they hit Japan and South Korea and U.S. military force in the region. They have tested one ICBM that can range all of the U.S., not Seattle and Honolulu, but all of the U.S. Within 5 years, they will be a declared nuclear global power. They've done it with a lot of help out of the Russians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, and others, and it's irreversible. Nothing we could do, in my view, will even remotely get them to denuclearize. So if you start with that presumption and say, what are we going to do about it? And I say you've got two choices. One is you can conduct some form, they were talking about the bloody nose attack, in which you'd selectively go after a missile just before it's launched. What we do have the capability to do is go after North Korean nukes with conventional air and sea power, and in 72 hours we'd knock out more than 90% of their capability. There's no question about it. It would almost guarantee the opening of high-intensity combat on the Korean Peninsula. I'll offer another assurance which makes people uneasy. If it comes to all-out war with North Korea, in less than 6 months, the U.S. Armed Forces and the 700,000 troops of the South Korean Armed Forces will utterly destroy the North Korean military. There's no question that that will happen. We'll get most of their Air Force and Navy in the first 48 hours. As he's losing, he'll probably go nuclear. So I think when you take the binary choice and you say, okay, why don't we go knock out his missiles, I think you're now committing yourself to a very bitter war in the Korean Peninsula, which nobody signs up for, period. Politically, the U.S. won't sign up for it. So I say we're not going to do it, unless by miscalculation. Here's another problem. Kim Jong-un is insecure in his control of power. Those generals may kill him with good reason if he looks weak. He's trying to stay in office. It's a criminal regime, that's the good news, rather than an ideological or religious regime. He didn't care about anything except regime survival and Courvoisier for he and the generals. So that's his motivation. And what he's learned, though, from his father and grandfather is the cycle of provoke, negotiate, get reward, provoke again. He's run that. I've been part of it. Reasonable people will look at what's going on and say, do we really have an option of initiating a war against North Korea? The answer always comes back, no. And so we've continued down this path, and now we're facing a nuclear power. I think we're going to end up, unless Kim Jong-un miscalculates and fires 100 artillery rounds into downtown Seoul, in which case I think it's game on. And that will be really sad. But he might do that, particularly with the taunting, the idiocy of publicly shaming a brutal dictator. So I think we're going to live with a nuclear-armed North Korea. And we got to invest more fulsomely in strategic missile defense. There's some new technologies, airborne laser on drones. There's a dozen things we can do to mitigate that threat to the United States and our allies. We're still not going to like it because we're dealing with a criminal regime. But I think that's where this is all going. The games, the girls' hockey teams, that's all nonsense. It's not going to have any impact on anything. I mean, we ought to try it. It's all good. You ought to engage diplomatically. You ought to do everything in your arsenal. But none of this is going to work. They're a nuclear power, and so they will remain.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me jump into Russia, my favorite subject. Vladimir Putin is going to be, well, I can actually say he will be reelected on March 18th. I mean, almost without doubt. He is up for reelection March 18th, presidential elections. I'm actually going to go and cover them, so it will be very interesting to watch it. The relationship with President Trump continues to be very complex because you have, on the one hand, the inability of Mr. Trump to criticize Vladimir Putin for almost anything. I can tell you, I watch the Russian media a lot, and they are now literally mocking Trump for the inability to run a government. There was like a meme just a couple of days ago where I saw left side of the picture is Donald Trump standing in the Oval Office looking at Vladimir Putin, who is dressed in kind of a partisan suit from the old Civil War in 1918 or so. And Vladimir Putin is about to sit down in the chair behind the desk in the Oval Office. In other words, you can interpret it many ways, but I think it's like, I can't handle it, can you, Vlad? So, but, you know, on the other hand, you do have Putin certainly pushing the United States, moving very aggressively, diplomatically on Syria now that he has basically helped the government to subdue. How does the Trump administration carry out a rational relationship with Russia when you have this disparity between what the president cannot do and what they actually should be doing to work on issues like North Korea, Iran, et cetera?
Well, I tell you, what a statement, never mind a question. When you actually watch what's happening in the federal government, I'm a student of the federal government for the last 50 years. There is no strategy, there is no policy. Mattis says things that are quite sensible all the time that are completely at variance with what the President of the United States says. But so does John Kelly, so does Tillerson. The UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, is a very astute person, no experience at all in international diplomacy, will say things at variance with all the rest of them. So I'm sure the Russians have no idea what to do about us. I think they're sad they got Trump in office. I said before the election, they're ill-served by having an unstable, irrational U.S. government. We're still the most powerful force on the face of the earth, not just militarily, economically, value system. Russia is all screwed up, heroin addiction, AIDS, dropping lifespan from Russian males steadily. They're running a kleptocracy. It's just astonishing. So what do we do about it? By the way, they're dangerous if you live right near them. I don't think they're almost any danger to the United States at all, and I really don't believe they're a danger to Western Europe. They got nukes, and we're worried about their nukes because they don't know where they are half the time. They dismantle them, and suddenly they got literally hundreds of metric tons of fissile material, HEU, weapons-grade fissile material, and the accountability. And, I was in there in the days when they started coming apart. They didn't have PAL unlock devices on their nukes. They didn't have serial numbers on their Spetsnaz backpack nukes. So Russia is not much of a threat, but it's a danger to live near. So now here's the big question, I think, for the American citizens, as we look at it. NATO, the Socratic method of teaching, you ask questions, you try and get students. So what's the highest law of the land under the U.S. Constitution? And so the trick question, the answer is, it's a treaty approved by the U.S. Senate. That's the highest law of the land. NATO is a treaty that we're a participant to. It used to be 16 nations. They all had common values. They were all terrified of the Soviet juggernaut, the Warsaw Pact. That kept us together for 2 decades. But now, for God's sakes, the Baltic republics are part of NATO. Did you know you committed your sons and daughters and treasure to defending the Baltic republics with no U.S. military power that could remotely respond? We have to think through what we're going to do about Russia in the coming years, and we haven't done it. And Putin's just a KGB thug, and not a very astute one at that. But he and his buddies have divvied up the wealth of the Russian. He told them, look, the Faustian bargain is keep your mouth shut on politics, and I'll let you make money and go to the Riviera in the summer. And apparently they bought into it. No.
We have about 4 more minutes of this question or this discussion part before we get to questions. And I wanted to ask one kind of broader question, which is big picture. I was just looking at the Gallup poll On approval of U.S. leadership, it is down to 30% from 48% just last year. That's an enormous drop. Among our allies and partners, it's down 10% or more. If you have a drop in the respect for the United States, you mentioned the United States pulling back, or the administration pulling back in certain areas. There are other countries that will gladly fill that gap. China, which has its own ideology, its own approach. Russia would love to. There are many other countries that would come in, and move into those gaps. So what in your evaluation, Barry, what do you think the danger of this retrenchment is to the United States long term?
Well, I think one of the dangers is 30-some-odd% of the American people still support the President of the United States with the objective characterizations that are being made about how he responds to international as well as domestic policy. So we've got a bunch of Americans. By the way, I'm empathetic to it because I think a lot of Americans were disgusted with both political parties with good reason. They said these people don't mean what they say. They run for office. Even the public rhetoric on punditry, people start on the left, you win your primary, and then you move to the center. It's not like people have no principles. So folks ended up voting for Mr. Trump as a protest, I think. And 30% of the country is still with him. By the way, that international loss of status, the last view graph I show on a presentation is the annual Gallup poll on to what degree do Americans, you and I, have trust in the great institutions of your government. The U.S. Congress is down below 10%. The most important branch of our co-equal branches is Congress, and we don't trust them. We sort of trust our own senators and congressmen, but not the institution. This president, now the lowest in the history of the poll taking at this time in his tenure, the court system, on and on. The most trusted institution in American society, the armed forces, bar none, for 20-some-odd years. And I tell people it's not because the admirals and generals are all that cute. It's because your sons and daughters write mom and dad and say, I'm in an institution of integrity and courage and purpose. So we got a real problem right now, you and I. The wealthiest society in the history of mankind, good people, Rotary, starting with Rotary, and we don't trust our own institutions. There we are.
Let me sneak in one last question, which would be, in the course that I'm teaching at the University of Washington, the Evans School, we look at the National Security Council, the NSC, which is basically the body that advises the president on these big issues of war and peace and how to present facts to him to make the biggest decisions that you can make in an administration. I'm watching the NSC and wondering what, in your opinion, is President Trump's decision-making process. No, I'm being very objective. How does he make the decisions? Is he actually an active part of those decisions with a process of people, the bureaucracy bringing up these facts and information to him, the data? Or is it, as you mentioned, tweets and certain members of the administration saying one thing, Trump undermining it? Is there a purpose to what seems like a very chaotic process?
Well, certainly it's an unsettling situation. The National Security Advisor is a young friend of mine for 25 years, H.R. McMasters, a serving three-star general, brilliant man, PhD in history from Duke University, wrote a book that's still a classic about misuse of power, the JCS during the Vietnam War. And he's doing the best he can. And by the way, he and Kelly have fired most of the crazies, not all, but most of them out of the White House. So the people working there are very, capable. The White House, a couple thousand people writ large. It's a giant organization, communications, logistics, et cetera. And Kelly's starting to run it so it looks like an organization. It was just a a fraternity gone bad for the first 6 months. I think they've got a process, but I think the president, his book Fire and Fury, Wolf's book, which probably is 49% nonsense, I might add, but certainly the tone of it, of a president of the United States wandering around eating cheeseburgers, watching cable TV, and tweeting out, that is largely what's going on. And so, by the way, he's got instincts. And the Democrats, who have lost their minds on countering him, are always after the wrong issue. The poor man doesn't know he doesn't have a button for nuclear weapons. He has instincts that resonate with a lot of Americans. Protect your borders, keep American jobs at home, on and on. The fact that he doesn't know what he's talking about is a separate issue. So I think we got a real problem, and
Well, on that note, I think it's time to turn to the audience. So we have about, Ken, how many how many minutes do we have, do you think? Like 10 minutes? 15? Oh, 15, my goodness. This is fabulous. Okay, well, of course, Kathy.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, General. Jill, you mentioned in passing China stepping into the void that the U.S. leaves. I wonder if the General will comment more about China. Everything I read says that looms large on our national security front in the future.
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on China. I've been there a bunch of times. I've great admiration. By the way, we've never had better relationship with China in U.S. history, bar none, and that's good, not bad. Our economic cooperation is intense. Student exchange. We have tens of thousands of U.S. students all over China and vice versa. So things are actually not all that bad. And we've got a government that's not too ideological. And Xi is somebody we can deal with. He's a tyrant of the Communist Party. And by the way, there's only about a dozen commies left in China. The rest of them are making money in the eastern part of the country. And so where are they going? And, I was on CNBC a couple of years ago, some idiot that talked about, he'd just written a book on the Chinese Navy, and it was now at parity with U.S. Navy. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The Chinese traditionally defend their borders. They don't make international mischief. So I think we ought to be relatively positive. Now, Jill's comment about, can China step in and provide global leadership? That's much of the pundit class is on that topic. I don't even remotely believe that. They've never figured out how to govern China. They still don't. 1.3 billion people wandering around, some of them third world people, Shanghai, the utopia of the future, minus the environmental concerns. The Chinese military is not even close to being a threat to U.S. national security. And I'm one of the few people saying that publicly. I understand that, but they're not kidding me. They're not in a position to seize Taiwan, to menace the Japanese. By the way, one of the strongest militaries in all the Asian Rim is the Japanese Self-Defense Force. Their air power and sea power is first rate. So I think China, the key is stay engaged with them economically, politically, culturally. They're an important part. They ought to have a military that matches their geopolitical aspirations, one would argue, but we'd better stay 2 generations in advance of them. And we're not doing that. We're not investing in U.S. air and naval power. So that's my principal concern dealing with the Chinese.
Yes, sir. Is that on? I'm sorry this isn't a semester long, first of all. Thank you very much. How about a minute on Afghanistan?
Well, I've been in and out of Afghanistan for the last 15 years. It's a very odd situation. I know Joel knows a ton about it. My son served 2 tours there, in and out of Iraq, Afghanistan, all throughout this wartime period as an adjunct professor up at West Point. And the Afghans in particular, our soldiers like them if they're not trying to blow you up or poison you on the evening meal. But they're good students, they're great businessmen, they're great soldiers, they're a lot of fun to be around. If you show an illiterate Afghan how to operate a diesel generator, An hour later, he's operating it. They can figure out how to submit contract paperwork to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we can barely figure out how to do it ourselves. So they're very interesting, impressive people. And we've come a long way. I mean, when we went into Afghanistan at the start of this war, there weren't two bricks, one standing on top of another. The country was totally destroyed. Now they got TV stations and colleges and a parliament, or if you walk inside, people are actually in there in a modern-looking building. They have a foreign service. The expatriates all came back. So a lot of things have happened. They have an army and a police force and on and on. The only thing they'll never have is a functional central government that unites people that are historically trying to kill each other. And so that Pashtuns and Hazaras and Uzbeks and Turkish peoples, and they're all trying to kill each other. They're not going to stop. We're there as long, and every administration looks at this and says, are we ever going to achieve an outcome where we've created an operative Japan, an operative Germany? No, never going to happen. On the other hand, to be sympathetic to them, if we pull our 15,000 troops out, and if NATO, I think, is down to 8,000, pull out, the place immediately goes to all-out civil war. Millions of refugees head for the exit back into Iran, Pakistan, the Central Asian republics. The Taliban start enslaving women more than they're normally enslaved. It would be a disaster. No administration has the guts to do it. We're stuck. The price is that big. Your armed forces will fight for the next 50 years if asked to in Afghanistan. Horrendously dangerous work now in particular. There's very few of them on the ground. So, you get a dozen special ops sergeants in some remote place, and there's very little U.S. air power, medevac, gunships, et cetera. So it's very tricky to be there. But I think we're stuck. We can't come out.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. General, you mentioned North Korea has become a nuclear power. Iran will become a nuclear power. Who's after Iran?
Well, there's some 35 nations that can go nuclear. And by the way, let me broaden the question. I've spent my entire life working weapons of mass destruction since I was a lieutenant. Nukes, chem, bio. We did away with bio first. We did away with chemical. By the way, chemicals are a lousy weapon, so are biological agents for an organized state. They're not a bad terrorist device. Now we've got cyber warfare, which is a weapon of mass destruction. And so what you look at is thresholds to entry to get into these 4 WMD. The nukes, luckily, are a challenging industrial process. The science is widely known. All you need is 40 kilograms of weapons-grade fissile material, and you can make a nuke. The Libyans were that close when they handed it over to having a nuclear capability, with help from the Pakistanis primarily, but also the North Koreans. So I think the nuclear, there's 30-some-odd nations that can own nuclear. The Japanese could have 1,000 weapons 3 years from now. We don't want that to happen. Proliferation of nuclear weapons guarantees higher probability of employment and regional conflict. The threshold of entry on chemicals, if you can make beer, you can make unstable VX nerve agent. Biological, we had one nutcase U.S. scientist in Fort Detrick, Maryland, that single-handedly made what we characterized as weapons-grade anthrax. Now you go down to cyber warfare, you get 3 pimply teenagers in a basement in Estonia can take us for $80 million a year. And so right now, the major powers, and by the way, the most powerful cyber warfare capability on the face of the earth is the U.S. Don't you mistake it. The biggest concentration of math PhDs on the face of the earth is at NSA headquarters. So we know what we're doing. And when it comes to the major powers, everyone's reconnaissance of their enemies in the event of larger conflict. And there's a ton of espionage economic activity going on. But so far, the Iranians went after us a little bit and the North Koreans, but there's a big threat. your armed forces are reasonably prepared to fight in a cyber warfare environment. The banking system isn't. So we got some challenges, and nukes is a horrific example of it.
General, a couple of weekends ago, there were reports of an impending missile attack on the Hawaiian Islands that lasted for 38 minutes. Do you happen to know what the President of the United States was doing during those 38 minutes?
Well, I know what I was doing. I was on the lanai in Waikiki waiting for the white flash to go off over the beach. We called my wife called our oldest daughter here in Seattle, didn't answer the phone. 8 hours later, she said, "What happened? I was drinking wine in your house." I have to do a little better in the care factor. Well, you know, that's another example, though, of this focus on Trump. Trump didn't have anything to do with this. Neither did the U.S. Armed Forces. Pacific Command never did send an alert to the 2 yahoos over in the Hawaiian Emergency Management area. And by the way, I'm sort of sympathetic. The poor man, I've seen the screen from NBC. It was a mouse click, and the top of the screen says test menu. And then there's a live option and a test option below that. So he just screwed up, and then there was no way to get it back. And by the way, no hotel had any implementing plans. 40 minutes later, the unnamed resort we were staying in got on the internal thing. And I tried to get my wife to go to an internal corridor. No, she wasn't doing that. I didn't want to get dressed. If you go in the internal corridor to survive a nuclear bath, you have your makeup on and be dressed. So it was primarily just an example of a complete lack of civil defense. And the president was at Mar-a-Lago, and they told him at the H.R. McMaster told him playing golf, and he said, whatever, and he kept playing golf. But he wasn't involved in that. Neither was the armed forces, just goofy. We need civil defense, by the way. Not if you're in the target zone. If we get a major nuclear attack, 30 weapons out of North Korea, there'll be 5 to 15 million of us killed. But the civil defense for areas around that strike zone would be important, and they're not there. This state is completely unprepared, in my view, to deal with emergency situations. And we ought to pay attention to it. Tsunamis, active shooters, terrorist attacks, whatever. Look what happened in India. Remember, we had a handful of Pakistani terrorists got into Mumbai and terrorized the city for 3 or 4 days. You got to get organized before crises happen.
Mm-hmm. And one more question, I think, back there, sir.
General McCaffrey, killer robots, lethal, artificially intelligent, autonomous weapons. There's a convention, the 1980 Convention on Conventional Weapons, and they met again annually in Geneva in November and weren't able to take any action with respect to getting nations to agree to limit these. Do you have any, following up on your question on cyber warfare, do you have any view as to whether we're about to enter a new era of killer robot arms race?
Well, the robotics era is here. It's been here for about 10 years. Everyone's got them. I think the autonomous killer robots is nonsense. I mean, we have such constraints, rules of engagement on U.S. military actions, it's almost beyond belief. We have lawyers that sign off at every level. By the way, it's going to be a problem if we have to fight the North Koreans, which is going to be all-out war. But I wouldn't worry about killer robots. I think one of the problems you've got is, right now, the U.S. in particular, for 10 years, we've been nailing people all over the face of the earth with remotely piloted vehicles armed with Hellfire missiles and other devices, and we're now improving them every day. So, I mean, if there's 3 terrorists in Yemen and the Yemenis can't deal with them, we'll go in and kill them either with special operations, ground attack, or with UAVs. And that's a reality right now. I've been on TV interviews where they go on and on about the outrageous thing. There was no warrant. You don't even know the names of the people you're attacking from with an armed robot over Yemen. I said, wow, you know, for God's sakes, I've tried to kill a lot of people that I didn't know their name either, you know. What does that have to do? It's such a silly comment. It's almost beyond belief. "What's your name?" And we shout back and forth. I don't know. But I think the robotics is a problem. It's, by the way, the collateral damage has gone from 100 down to 4 because of our armed robots. We've designed tiny munitions now. When we started 10 years ago, there was one motorcycle guy coming out of Raqqa moving at 80 miles an hour, and a Navy F-A-18 hit him with a 2,000-pound bomb right on his helmet. That's overkill.
Okay, we have one short last question, and luckily it's from one of my students. Thank you.
Yes,
James.
thank you, General. Thank you, Jill, as well. Question about the Middle East. The Saudi leadership seems quite pleased with the Trump administration. And I'm wondering, specifically with Saudi intervention in Yemen, if you foresee the United States at any point stepping in and encouraging or preventing the Saudis from further attacks there?
Yeah, well, I've always liked dealing with the Saudis, to be blunt. Of all the Middle East countries, that's the one you can go to and expect to not get mugged, stay in a 5-star hotel. Everyone will deal nicely with you. They put their kids at University of Washington, not at a madrasa in Pakistan. They bank here. They spend their summers on the Spanish Riviera. Their senior people living in some dingy-looking place. When you go in the local emir's palace, which looks so bad from the outside, you wouldn't want to stop and loot it if you were on a tank headed north into Iraq. You go in there, it's gold faucets, and the wives are all educated in France, and so they're actually fairly easy to deal with, and they're a reliable partner for the U.S. But they've been living in the 16th century. So now we've got a 32-year-old prince who we're not sure he knows what he's doing. He's arrested all of his brothers and quarter brothers in the Ritz-Carlton, or the Four Seasons downtown. He's aggressively, the Saudis never were fighters. They never actually fought anybody. When they have an internal tribal struggle, one tribe would gallop around the other tribes 14 times. They'd make an assessment on who had more power, and the guy that thinks he's going to lose and assassinates his own tribal leader. That was their idea of warfare. Now they're getting aggressive. Iranian Shiite nuclear-armed power is their enemy, not the Israelis. The war in Yemen, that's a proxy war against Iran. The war in Qatar is a proxy war against countering the royal family. He may be in trouble. He's trying to liberate women from slavery to modern times. He's trying to modernize the economy, trying to work away from the old. He's got a lot in his plate. I'm glad we're supporting him. I'm not sure he's going to pull this off.
All right, so didn't I tell you this program was going to make you think? Yes. Awesome. So thank you, Jill. And General, as a thank you, we have a donation for you equal to 150 pounds of produce that's been made on your behalf to Rotary First Harvest. And this gift will provide 300 healthy servings of produce to families in need through food banks in Washington State. So thank you. Thank you, Cindy. Okay. So quick thank yous for making this program happen. Totem reporter, Pete Delaney, thank you. And I also want to acknowledge all of our sponsors, especially our gold level underwriters, Ken Ham, our First Choice Health, and Bob Alexander, now retired from Alaska National Insurance. So if you missed last week's meeting or know anybody that might be interested in this one, you can just go to Seattle Rotary online. We've been recording these programs for the last 10 years. And did you know that underwriting, Seattle Rotary Online, is a significant club and community service opportunity? So it's a great way to market to other community leaders. So if you want to know more about underwriting, please contact the Rotary office or Dave Endicott. So coming up next week, we are at the Westin, and we'll have Governor Jay Inslee. So in closing, so this topic of national security and my recent trip to Little Rock, Arkansas, this was for the gathering of president-elects and executive directors of the large clubs. It had me thinking about my time and my time on Earth. So in Little Rock, I was able to meet Ms. Elizabeth Eckerd. She was one of the Little Rock Nine, a civil rights heroine, yes. So I was deeply moved by her story, and I came across a thought for the day that I just wanted to share. So each of us has a bank. Its name is time. Every morning, it credits us with 86,400 seconds. 86,400 seconds. Every night, it writes off as a loss whatever of this you failed to invest to a good purpose. So it carries over a zero balance. So if you're lucky, the next day, it opens up a new account for you, and each night, it burns the remains of the day. So you might ask yourself, what am I doing with today's deposit? Am I investing it so I get from it the utmost in harmony and success? The clock is ticking. Make the most of today, and it's been fun, everybody. See you next week.